I give the call to the member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start, Deputy Speaker, by correcting the record because, I'm sorry, the previous member did mislead the House. The member for Kingsford Smith did mislead the House in stating that I said that we should stop the increase in the compulsory superannuation guarantee from 9.5% to 12%. That is actually just false. It is misleading the House. What I said was that we should consider the choice of whether people have the option of choosing to take an increased superannuation or wages. And I don't understand when, if the member for Kingsford Smith, who's skulking out of the chamber now, is prepared to go around and mislead and deceive the Australian people and this chamber in pursuit of his objective because he wants to mislead them as a justification for his argument, then we all know the weight and the gravitas that can be added to his argument, which is somewhere between 0 and nothing, and there's not much of a cigarette paper between the two of them. So, in saying that and clarifying the record, and I'm sorry, I'm disappointed that I was not able to do that at the time when the misleading statement was made, this bill is quite straightforward in its intent. It's designed to ensure there's the integrity of the superannuation system for Australians and working Australians, and making sure that there's a pathway for people to comply with the law, to make sure they pay their appropriate amount of superannuation, that where there is an excess that it's not being done in inappropriate means, and to make sure we build a sense of public confidence. And that's a fundamental and worthy objective. It's something that we should all support as part of a robust system that meets the needs of Australians. But I have long had the view that we need to make sure that the system has integrity for everybody. And what we've had is the development of a sector or a superannuation system over a period of 30 years, which has progressively evolved with different legislative and regulatory arrangements to make sure that Australians can retire with confidence and dignity. And of course we know, and the previous speaker, outside of his misleading statements, raised lots of concerns around the challenge of an ageing population, points and concerns of which I hold very strongly, about making sure that people in the best position to be able to stand on their own 2 feet for the entirety of their retirement. But we also need to acknowledge that the evolution of the superannuation system has led to a particular conclusion or a particular design. And what we have at the moment is a very fund-centric focus around the superannuation system, a very fund-centric process of legislation and regulation which focuses the design around how they should operate. But what's missing often in the discussion around compulsory superannuation is a focus on consumer choice. Firstly, when it comes down to it, superannuation and choosing your superannuation fund is the most significant financial decision that you will make, and probably between that and buying a house, the most significant one you will make over a lifetime if you're the average Australian. And that's why we should be encouraging, empowering Australians to, one, have choice, rather than have them compelled to be able to take up options under their industrial arrangements and workplace arrangements. But secondly, they should be able to have choice where they are able to choose between any different model based on what they think best suits their interests over the long run. That means we need comparability and transparency in the system, because at the moment the system is rigged and favoured for some funds against the interests of Australians. And I make no apology. I'm in this chamber to represent Australians, not capital interests, as some people seem to be, because they seem to want to constantly preserve the regulations that are in place to favour the few. And when you have a fund-centric approach, that's where you end up. When you have a consumer-interested approach, you have legislation that guarantees the integrity of the system, like this one does. It makes sure that people have choices across models, whether it's self-managed superannuation funds, the choice to be able to use retail funds, or of course to be able to choose industry funds as alternatives. And they're not automatically thrown into one camp, despite what their personal preferences may be. They're not defaulted into it. We don't discourage people from making active choices, and we don't discourage people from learning about the choices and the options that are available. Now, of course, there's huge benefits from fund aggregation, and nobody would argue otherwise. It enables them to do things like be able to borrow, increase their borrowing capacity in wholesale markets and prices. But when it comes down to it, we should want consumers and workers to be informed, to be literate, to be able to compare, and to have transparency around the different options that they can do, so they can make informed decisions. Because that is the basis in which, not just at that point they make an informed decision, but it's when people get a sense and understanding from the 18 or 16-year-old who started their first job to understand the gravity and the weight of the biggest, or one of the biggest financial decisions, and certainly the biggest first financial decision they'll make over their entire lifetime. And we want people engaged. One of the big problems with the superannuation system today, Deputy Speaker, and the entire retirement system, of course, is that many people might default into a fund and they don't really think about it apart from getting the occasional statement that they get from their fund, chuck it in the bin once yearly or twice yearly, and don't engage until they're about 55, once the kids are off their hands and they actually have to start thinking about their retirement. And that's not an uncommon story. We want Australians to have a greater sense of ownership and empowerment and responsibility over their retirement, to understand the gravity and the weight of the situation that we all face, both as individuals but as a country, to be able to secure our long-term dignity and choice throughout our whole life cycle. And that doesn't just come, firstly, from the, as I said before, default options, not just about comparability and transparency, but also around portability. So if people may choose to, as an active decision, even if it's a default, to go into an industry fund, if they decide they get better returns or better outcomes for themselves or greater empowerment and choice, they can move over to retail funds as they see fit. And then if they get to a point where they see it's in their advantage, they choose the alternative of going into a self-managed fund, as I have. And that they won't be dissuaded and they won't face punitive measures. Now, of course, we know that this is anathema to the opposition, not just because of their obsession with only defending the interests of the few and the capital that they have influence and control over, and their constant demonisation of the private sector. But we saw that very nakedly and clearly in the lead up to the last election, where just about every single policy they had in the economic space was designed to diminish the power and the choice of Australians to manage their own finances. If you look at their policy around franking, abolition of refundable franking credits, that plan was designed to move people out of SMSFs and push them into industry super where they had influence and control. And they ought to be ashamed of themselves. Shutting down choices of Australians to suit themselves. And that's why some of us are so proud to have stood up against that agenda, the nefarious agenda of the opposition, which no doubt the head of a Hydra will come back and they will pursue it once again, because their objective at the heart of it is not actually about the integrity of the system. Their objective at the heart of it has nothing to do with the taxation system. Their agenda at every point has something to do with one thing, and that's control. And it's their control over Australians' lives. The same was true of negative gearing in their approach, where they wanted to shut down the pathway to do that, to corporatise housing and to create the pathways, but the only people who got to invest in housing were their mates. Well, Deputy Speaker, I don't think that's right. I think every Australian should be able to stand up on their own 2 feet and take control of their own personal circumstances and not be pushed around by the Labor Party or their buddies. Some of us should stand up for the empowerment of 26 million Australians, not just those who sit on that side of the chamber. And if they think that some of us are going to sit here in silence and wait until they're able to achieve their nefarious ends, they're kidding themselves. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.